Well, yes, Steve. This time last year, we were sitting here and I said, having listened to Professor Stiglitz say there was no inflation problem, that we should actually be worried and that there was a risk of a 1970s scenario. And I said, if there's a war, remember this is a year ago, that's when you get inflation expectations really taking off. Well, we got the war in Ukraine, and we also have a risk of instability elsewhere, not least Taiwan, between the US and China. So the ingredients of the 1970s are already in place. The monetary and fiscal policy mistakes of last year, which set this inflation off, are very like the mistakes of the late 60s. And then, as in 1973, you get a war, except that this war is lasting much longer than the 1973 war, and so the energy shock that it's causing is actually going to be more sustained. So the question that I'm asking myself is, yeah, it looks a little bit like the 1970s, but are we sure it's not going to be worse than that? I mean, most people, when you have this conversation, kind of assume it can't be that bad, and they can't really envision double-digit inflation in the US, but we're already there with the UK. The number of countries with double-digit inflation in the world is already north of 40, and it will soon be a higher number than that. And so I ask myself, why shouldn't it be as bad as the 1970s? Why shouldn't it actually be worse? I mean, let's think about why it could be worse. Let's think about productivity growth. Looking at the supply side, that's actually worse than in the 1970s. Let's look at the level of debt. It's actually higher than in the 1970s. What about the demographics? They're clearly worse than in the 1970s. At least in the 1970s, you had détente between the superpowers. I don't see much détente between Washington and Beijing right now. In fact, I see the opposite. I see brinkmanship over Taiwan. So I'm going to go out on a limb. Last year I said we should be worried about the 1970s, and this year I'm going to say let's consider the possibility that the 2020s could actually be worse than the 1970s. The distributions in history are not normal. They really aren't a bell curve, particularly when it comes to things like wars, or for that matter financial crises, or for that matter pandemics. These events are in fact distributed in a completely non-normal way with very fat tails. And there's a lot of non-linearity in a world where one crisis, as I said to you a year ago, leads to another. You start with a plague, something we don't see very often, a really large global pandemic which kills millions of people, disrupts the economy in all kinds of ways, disrupts labor markets in all the major economies as well as the minor ones. Then you hit it with a big monetary and fiscal policy shock. I think Larry Summers got it right last year when he said this is fiscal overkill. I think one could also have said then that the Fed was way behind the curve. And then you add the geopolitical shock. So it's not actually a bell curve we're looking at. In most cases, when we're looking at historical disasters, it's not normally distributed at all. And that's why people find it hard to think about. Because in their heads, the world is kind of a bunch of averages. And there aren't likely to be really bad outcomes. This leads people, I think, as I've heard in a number of discussions today, to be somewhat over-optimistic. We did some surveys earlier today here of Italian business sentiment. Low single-digit percentages were expecting declines in investment, declines in turnover. I mean, this is a country that's heading towards a recession with very high probability.
Are we really in for a very, very serious decline?
I think
when I say decline, I'm talking about economically, politically, and obviously financially as well.
Well, Steve, inflation's the place to start here. The central banks, I think, became rather full of themselves in the period after the financial crisis. They'd been a little overconfident when they talked about the Great Moderation. Then they decided that they'd saved the world after 2008 and were the only game in town. But I think they made a fatal mistake early last year when the Fed chair, Jay Powell, said, look, we don't really worry about inflation. Inflation's not going to be a problem the way it was back in the 1970s. In fact, we wouldn't mind somewhat higher inflation. In fact, we're going to change our targeting regime to an average 2%. Now, this was a signal to ordinary people of what economists call a regime change. And I think what happened was that the combination of pandemic, fiscal and monetary excess, and then on top of that a war, caused inflation expectations all around the world to leap. And now that that's happened, the central banks are scrambling to get their credibility back. And the thing about it is that they aren't anywhere close to positive real rates. You have to recognize that the rate increases we've seen so far...
Do we need to get to positive real rates?
Well, according to most economists who think about monetary policy, like my colleague John Taylor, who was quoted earlier today in the session, absolutely. And it's impossible to find an example where you bring inflation under control without positive real rates in any time in the recent past. It's also very hard to see a scenario in which you bring inflation down in the US or in Europe without a recession in the process.
Are you saying that without 8-9% interest rates, or let's say inflation abates somewhat to 7%, without 7% plus inflation rate, we haven't got a chance of taming this inflation dragon?
Well, it's expected inflation that you really need to look out for, and that's not as high as our current headline rates. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly right to say, and I'll answer this as an historian, that if you look at the Fed today, its position is quite interestingly comparable with the Fed's position in the 1970s. The Fed in the 1970s raised rates. It did it several times. But each time, there were 4 occasions when it raised rates in the 70s, and each time it paused or reversed itself at the first sign of economic trouble, as soon as it seemed like a recession was underway. And I think it's perfectly possible that the Powell Fed is going to be like the Fed of Arthur Burns, raises rates, then says, that's enough, we can rest.
He's not going to. There was an exact reference to what you just mentioned.
Exactly, and that's because the Fed has finally been paying attention to financial history, and I think also to my friend Larry Summers. But that was a change of tone. Only the previous press conference, he'd been talking as if they'd already got to the neutral rate. So I'm not convinced, let me put it this simply, that Jay Powell is the reincarnation of Paul Volcker. He still has some way to go to convince me that he's not, in fact, the reincarnation of Arthur Burns. The dream, the hope, which I think is evaporating in markets right now, is that there could be some kind of magical soft landing where you wouldn't really, in fact, have to have positive real rates. Everything would just calm down all by itself. I think that hope is fading. It's been fading certainly since Powell's remarks at Jackson Hole. So I think one has to assume that there is a global slowdown which will be a recession in Europe for sure. In the US, that's less clear, as I said, because the Fed is still not really hitting the brakes hard. I mean, financial conditions have not markedly tightened. But I think if you take the big picture, look at Europe, almost certainly heading for recession because of the economic consequences of the war and the energy crisis. Look at China. I mean, we forget this, but China's economic performance is so much worse than the Chinese Communist Party hoped that they had to scrap their growth target. And in practice, the Chinese economy is not growing at all, barely perceptibly at the moment, because of a combination of zero COVID, the collapse of consumer confidence, and a general sense that the party now prioritizes political power over economic growth.
Well, let me ask you about China then as well.
Well, Steve, it's inconceivable that Xi Jinping does not get his next third term as China's president, and he's clearly going to remain the dominant figure. We now know when the next party congress is. It's going to be happening in October. All we don't know is exactly who underneath Xi is going to be up or down. So we'll be watching closely to see how that standing committee looks, who gets the key jobs, is there a role for Li Keqiang, or is he out? But Xi is going to be in charge. They face a much deeper crisis than I think most people in the West understand. Not only has the economy stopped growing, not only do they not have a solution to the problem of COVID, remember their vaccines basically don't work, and their elderly aren't vaccinated anyway. But in addition, you have far worse demographic trends than people admitted until very recently. China's population could collapse in the rest of this century. In the extreme case, by 2/3. The base case from the United Nations is now that it will halve between now and the end of the century. And I haven't even got to the debt dynamics and the problem of the real estate sector. So from Xi Jinping's point of view, things have got very ugly indeed. The legitimacy that the party's enjoyed for decades on the basis of growth could very well fade away. What do you have left? If you're an authoritarian regime and you are no longer able to deliver sustained growth, let me see, scratch his chin. I know, let's go with nationalism, and let's point out...
Playbook there, isn't there?
There is a familiar playbook that if you see the situation as it's unfolding in Taiwan, it's not difficult to see, not this year, but in the relatively near future, a confrontation that will be far more dangerous than the one we just had over Nancy Pelosi's visit.
Which maybe is falling. Look, I'll give credit to Noura Rabini. This time last year, He said, we were talking, and he said, you've got to have read the Graham Allison book, Thucydides' Trap, and I'm like, no, I haven't. So I know you know Graham Allison, and I know you know the premise here, that looking at various historical examples, I think the first one and the most notable example in the book was the Spartans going to war with the Athenians. It wasn't inevitable, but it happened because of a load of policy mistakes. Is America and China falling into the Thucydides trap? Because you've just mentioned what from the Chinese side is going on, but from the American side, is it possible that they can take a bigger, more holistic view and avoid that trap?
Well, I was speaking about this with Graham, who's an old friend of mine, just the other day.
And that's showing off.
We are both very concerned.
I mentioned the book, you say I was talking to the author.
It's a fact
circles
that
you
he and I have spent years at Harvard as colleagues talking about this very issue. And he was, I think, as concerned as me when we spoke earlier this week. The key problem is that the United States is acting in ways that suggest that it wouldn't mind a showdown over Taiwan. And it's not just Nancy Pelosi paying a visit. It's the fact that multiple high-level U.S. delegations go to Taipei and in effect treat Taiwan as an independent country. It's not entirely unreasonable for people in Beijing to say, whatever happened to our deal back in 1972, that you'd respect our one China policy, and we wouldn't really force the issue that Taiwan is de facto autonomous. I think the US has moved away from strategic ambiguity and is now consistently, unambiguously saying that it will uphold Taiwan's de facto independence. And that's quite dangerous given just how sensitive this issue is. For Xi Jinping, remember, the reason that he argued that he needed an extension of his term in office was Taiwan. His ultimate goal as China's leader is to bring Taiwan under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And the United States is increasingly, unambiguously saying, oh no, you can't. Now, I would liken this in Cold War terms to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the closest the Cold War came to becoming a hot war. If there's going to be a hot war in Cold War II, I'm very much afraid that it'll be a hot war over Taiwan. And by the way, that would be far more economically disruptive than the Cuban Missile Crisis was.